We want to talk about now what's happening to those schools in Western Kenya, particularly in Kakamega County. And we've seen that another school now was shut down yesterday, and students were told to go home as many were hospitalized. Butere Boys High School, following what had happened earlier, where Mukumu girls students were hospitalized, some have died, and the school had to be shut down. To have this conversation with us in disaster preparedness and response, looking at these two cases as a case, is Edward Wanyonyi. Edward is a chairperson of the Disaster Risk Reduction Network for African Journalists. Chairperson, Disaster Risk Reduction Network for African Journalists. DRAJ. Edward, good morning.
Good morning.
It's a long title for an organization.
Quite long, but we were formed because of the whole international strategy on disaster risk reduction. Initially, it used to be called the Hyogo framework, and then now it moved towards now the Sendai framework because it was now inaugurated and promulgated in Sendai, Japan in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole lens we are looking at disaster issues is not just looking at the response or the preparedness. Now we are looking at reducing the risk. That's why now the current conversation discourse is around risk reduction.
Okay.
Yeah.
We shall continue with that, and you'll tell us what kind of data you collect and what you look at, as we also look at these two schools in Kenya as case studies. But to welcome you to the conversation, Bwanamuga has the proverb. It's from Congo, Brazzaville.
Yes, it is. A cat goes to a monastery, but she still remains a cat.
A cat goes to a monastery, but still remains a cat. Edward, what's that?
I think it's just like you can change the behavior.
Once a cat, always a cat.
Yeah.
So like you have a common theme this week with these proverbs from Congo City. Yesterday's, once bald-headed, you're always bald-headed.
That is true. The themes from Congo that I have selected seem to have a common theme. Yes. In fact, as you say it's true. I looked at some of these and I was wondering, goodness, there's a lot of similarity here. If I read some of the other ones that I looked at, some I wouldn't dare say on open air. And I would just read and leave it to myself and say, okay, I have heard you have spoken, and I will leave it at that.
Leave it at that.
Yes.
So your interpretation is you remain unchanged.
Yeah.
Okay. So as journalists who are then looking at disaster risk and reduction, what do you do? This is as journalists in this network.
So these are reporters who now taking a specialized view of how man-made natural disasters actually are happening in our continent, and at the same time providing a level of early warning and helping the discourse to reach local communities. The challenge is that the disaster conversation has largely been scientific and technical, and so local communities are having a challenge. At the same time, it has actually been very much Western-centric. And so the literature, you look at it, it's so much about tornadoes, typhoons, and things which we do not relate to in the continent, whereby our typical disasters are school fires, road traffic accidents are the highest in the continent. You're looking at
Building
issues with oil spillage, building collapsing. So we needed a very a new platform for how to have these conversations and actually downstep it, not just from the technical scientific, but also look at local languages and how vernacular conversations can take place, because that is typically who we are in this continent. If your mother calls you Eric, most likely you'll stop doing English and just switch to your mother tongue. It so happens instantaneously in most of our spaces. So we needed also that conversation to go to that space, and so that our African communities can benefit from this conversation.
So then, specific now, let's get into schools, because you've said some of the things that we see, those disasters that happen in schools.
Yeah.
We had the Precious, what was it called?
Sacred Heart.
The Sacred Heart Academy in Riruta. And what happened? No, not Sacred Heart. It was Precious in Riruta. The school that
the school,
collapsed.
the building collapsed 2020. 2019, sorry.
And it led to Professor Magoha saying, halt, let's review all the schools across the country. Let's see what's happening. and it ended up, shutting several schools down. Now we are seeing this happening in terms of health scares in schools that are actually leading to death and closure of schools and hospitalization of children. Are those what we should classify as our local disasters?
Yes, but I'll just take you back to 1991, St. Kizito. That was more or less like the first incident,
Yep.
And then, of course, you look at that was a case of, boys crossing over, and it was rape, it was arson, Arson has been the biggest, Changuli fire, you're talking about Bambolulu, Mazeras, a lot of documentation you find within schools have actually been within school fires. In fact, 2001 was one of the worst years because you had almost around 184 cases of school fires. Our challenge has been that you have the school fires issue being collated to a discipline issue. Yet it's actually a case whereby we have not prepared the schools to handle even fires. The kind of mattresses we are allowing the students to buy are actually just flammable, and yet there are options for non-flammable. The paint we use in the schools, in the walls, they are flammable paints. They're not non-flammable paints. So where you're putting your fire engines and actually your extinguishers, the access points. So yes, we might want to take it as a discipline issue, but the idea is that these are just actually death traps. Schools have not been built to be safe. Schools have just been built to be like dormitories whereby students learn, and we don't prepare for that disaster. So you're looking at the arson issues. You're also looking at issues to do with now the health scares, which are there because in populated schools where you're having 2,500 students at a minimum, because government is so excited about 100% transition, no one is looking at even the cases of health. You have one nurse, a nurse who is not well trained or even updated in terms of the school. We are expecting at least to have at least a clinical officer or even a medical officer, but that's not the case. And so what happens is that take a painkiller and go. Students are being treated to painkillers. Some of those painkillers are not they've not been changed over time.
Just same painkiller for the 60s.
For quite years. So what happens? No one is looking at quality assurance at the health level. The school nurse is not even going to the stores to check on the food. The public health officer hardly visits the school to check on the stores and to look at who are the suppliers. You even don't have a clear sourcing approach of the food that is there. Now, President Ruto says something very interesting, that they want to gravitate and move towards, removing, the fires in terms of like the cooking with using firewood so that we can move into gas. Now, imagine now that is another level of risk that is going to come into the schools where you have gas and you have, not preparedness in that space. So literally, our schools are basically going to be places we will collect dead bodies more often if we have not actually prepared ourselves and put the safety measures.
How exactly do you begin this process of preparedness? Is it in the buying of mattresses that put out fires? Is it in having paint that does not, or that is not inflammable? Or is it in ensuring that not only are the schools and the people who run it perhaps educated and inculcated into certain safety measures, but an educational process that enables even the children who are in school to understand what to do in the event of such? Is it something that should be in the curriculum?
Yes, ideally. What we had started an initial process at the National Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction some time back with the late Professor Mutula Kilonzo when he was Minister of Education, and he said we need to now look at that school safety manual and see how we can be able to make it part and parcel of the Basic Education Act. Because then one of the key proponents for that was basically you now introduce criminal liability when there are cases of negligence in schools. Professor Mutula Kilonzo, the late, was very clear that even the petrol has a value chain. It doesn't just land in the school. And there's an adult in the process. So let's get the adult culpable. And once we get the adult culpable, it will bring better deterrence. Because right now, for all the school fires you've talked about and the disasters, no one has been taken to court. No one has ever. We assume it's an act of God.
Yeah.
We just let it go. It's a laissez-faire situation, and parents are mourning. And you see where cases whereby a child, for example, becomes sick, utterly sick to the point of almost it's very critical. Then now the school says we are releasing now this child to go home just to go and die.
Or-
It's a case of negligence.
Or when they're dead, Edward.
Yes.
Because this is what we see. This is what we've seen. If we're looking at the present case, for
Yes.
example, 3 girls are dead.
Yeah.
You know, this is it. And we've got 250 almost who are in hospital. And for me, that's where the alarm is. That how is it possible that 250 girls are admitted in school, in hospital, from one school in 7 days, and nobody is really concerned about it until 3 of them die? And does it have to get to the point of death then for us to say, because they did not die from something else aside from the symptoms that these other 250 are suffering from?
Yes.
So it is this same illness that has killed these 3. The possibility of more dying is a very real and present danger. How does it get to that point? There's obviously something wrong there. Not only that, last year, the school head herself admitted that the same thing happened around the same time. They didn't get results. Nobody was really worried about it. Okay, it has happened again. So I agree. The laissez-faire attitude is just the same thing. Like, okay, well, we'll be fine. They'll be treated. They'll get out of hospital. But not really. 3 have died. Do they have to?
They don't have to, but the challenge is that we have also glorified these school principals, and nowadays we call them chief principals of national schools, and they move around as semi-gods. Parents cannot talk to them. Parents cannot even access them, you know, and so that they bring that attitude in everything to do with school safety, and also they're supported by government that looks at anything to do with school issues as a moral issue, and it's students just, you know, complaining, and the normal response is, let's introduce corporal punishment when students are making noise and they're even raising illegitimate issues. Safety issues are part of it. And so schools don't have even clear committees on disaster management. There's no, schools lack protocols in terms of having, how do you cascade and escalate an issue? At what point should a parent be notified? You know, at what point should the Ministry of Health or the county health officer be notified about an issue? So they don't have a critical incidents process and protocol that can actually be able to activate and even contain an issue. And so what happens is that they will release immediately. What happens? They release the student to the nearest facility.
Yeah.
Now, an outbreak like cholera is not something which you will want to start, you know, saying this student is just pretending. Maybe they don't want the cat, they don't want the exam. You know, these students always pretend, so we will contain them as many possible. Or possibly if they'll go out, they'll sneak and get into drugs. You know, that is an attitude that most teachers have. And meanwhile, the child will die. You know, when cholera sweeps, you don't have time to start negotiating, you know, and start trying to say that it's a moral issue, the children are pretending. That's what is lacking. The Basic Education Act does not have the mandate and the capacity for the Ministry of Education to rein in on schools. The school safety manual, as it's there.
What? Sorry. The Act does not give the Ministry of Education the mandate to rein in on schools.
It gives the mandate from managing the schools. And what do you have? You have curriculum support officers. So it's an academic context. It's not a whole of school approach. So the whole of school approach says that you need to ensure that the school exists in totality with the community, but at the same time even taking into consideration, for example, children with special needs. So when a fire alarm goes off, for example, which many schools even don't have that fire alarm, it will be making noise. Some schools don't even know where is the fire assembly point, you know. And so what happens is that students will just start making noise, and maybe most of them will gather towards a field or so before they can be able to know how to rescue. So when that system is supposed to be put in place, a critical incident as a protocol in the school, it has to delegate who does what. In this case, for example, Mukumu girls, the boarding master needed to have actually sounded the alarm. But not just sounding the alarm immediately when you have the first diagnosis, but also now looking back at where do you stop the plug?
Okay.
Where do you stop the plug? You start looking at food, you start looking at water, you start looking at the basic handling. Who are the people the workers who are cooking? tests for them and see, are they showing any symptoms?
So should these things have been done before?
They should have been done
Because,
before
Like now,
this-
what we see in Butere is
Yes.
that the school head has said, well, okay, the reason why we're asking you all to go home is not just because a number of you have gotten sick, but we want to now sanitize the school. We want to check on our stores, we want to remove our storage and whatever, and go through a process of sanitization. The question is it possible that this was not done prior to learners coming back to school in January, and that whatever the problem was would have started to fester if it was in the food stores, for example?
True.
So now I hear what you're saying. Who checks on this at the very beginning to make sure that all these standards have been met?
Schools have a challenge in this country because first term they say we are busy admitting Form 1, and so we are trying to look at selection. We are looking at the process and everything. No one goes to the dormitories and quality assurance. They will do it on day one when the parents are coming, because it's basically that's it. And even some public schools do not allow parents to go to the dormitories to check on where their children are sleeping. Some will say, you know what, just put the mattress here and then you go back. They don't even allow that. Now, most of the public schools, you find that there's a competition around how many streams you would have. So the higher the streams, the better you are doing. And that is just overpopulation in literal sense. So what happens is that some of these students are even sleeping on labs. Some of them are sleeping in dining halls because the spaces are so little and they're cramped up. Now, the Minister of Education person is supposed to come in and check, not just look at curriculum support. They're supposed to check all these issues and actually do a form of grading. Counties also have a level of, oversight, because the schools are happening in counties, and if there's any issues to do with capacity support,
Public health.
they will get from the school, from the county. That doesn't happen. So what happens is that the school safety manual, as it was developed some time back, is not being adhered to, but also it needs updating.
Okay, so that's where I'd like to come in. As the network of journalists, have you actually focused on our education system and looked at all those things? So starting from policy to the acts to the regulations to the manuals, do we have manuals that talk about safety, that talk about disaster preparedness, that talk about watching out for disaster, talk about disaster management? Do we have anything that a document that's like that from the Ministry of Education that should be going down to all the schools?
So we have a school safety manual that was prepared and supported by UNICEF. But the challenge that we also have within the disaster space in this country is we don't have a single coordinating agency and a single coordinating act. So we have a National Disaster Operations Center as a small quasi-department within the Ministry of Interior, but it doesn't have the oomph and the capacity and the legal mandate to actually coordinate anything. Yet that is supposed to be the mother act. What you have all other departments in the continent, what we are encouraging is to have civil protection agencies on a National Disaster Management Authority. Here we've decided to split that function and say we have a National Drought Management Authority, which will deal with drought issues. And then we have National Disaster Operations Center, which will just look at coordinating of the security elements around any kind of disaster. And then we used to have a National Disaster Management Unit during the time when terrorism was there, but then it has now cooled down. And then, of course, our default is Red Cross. Kenya Red Cross Society is supposed to be complementary, not the main actor, but that is what everyone includes. Private schools will tell you they will take arrangements with Red Cross, Kenya Red Cross Society, to support them.
Back to the manual.
For
somewhat,
public,
Edward.
yes.
What does the manual say?
The manual.
Because the manual is this book from the ministry.
Yes.
That says this is how all our schools should have.
Yes.
This is what, in terms of public safety and disaster and all, it'll also talk about, I expect,
Yes.
talk about the buildings. This is how much you shall have space for exit. This is how you shall create exits in the event of fire. This is how the alarm system shall be sounded. This is how the response shall be conducted. That manual exists.
There's a manual there, and that manual is very clear on issues to do with that time. They are talking about the spacing and the sizing of grills, for example, remove metal grills. It said after how many meters you need to put like a fire extinguisher, and which fire extinguisher you should be able to put that way. Challenge with that manual is that it has been outdated. It has been passed
How
by time.
old is it?
I think it was passed around 2005.
Okay.
In that manual, if you look at it, it is not conversant of the present times. Like right now, we are talking about
What is
halls.
outdated, for example, in that?
During that time, we used to have special education schools. Right now, we're talking about whole school approach. So we are saying even children with disabilities will study with other learners for purposes of inclusion, so that they are not discriminated. Number two, you look at it in terms of the school population has exceeded. The school population that time was 700 children. Right now, we are talking about schools with almost 1,500, 2,500, population-wise. Then most of the schools, in terms of the spaces, they were saying that they had the ability and the luxury of space. Now we are talking about schools which are talking about high-rise buildings. High-rise buildings are coming in, and they'll tell
But doesn't that show you that those things were happening without following the manual?
Yes, and there was no compliance check.
So it's not that the manual is outdated. The manual is still in effect, basically, because the manual is saying that you should have X number of students within this space, and within that space you shall provide this kind of air, this kind of exits, this kind of grill, this kind of lights to come in, right?
Yes.
So the manual is not outdated. It is.
Yeah, it's not reflected.
It's that it was ignored.
Yes, it was ignored. It was not put as a check and a mandatory check when the Ministry of Education is doing, safety or any kind of visits or inspections, because Ministry of Education comes in and says, even if Kenya National Examination Council, they're going to do checks around schools before KCP and KCSE. They don't look at safety issues. It's not something which they score against. So
And you know this for a fact.
Yes, I know this for a fact, because it's all about the academic aspect that he's looking at, not necessarily the safety aspect. Until an incident like this happens in Mukumu, like the time when I think 2 years ago when there was a building that collapsed in Kakamega, and they said, you know what, we need to look at even how these schools, some of them, they have old latrines. They're sinking right now. So we need to check on how these schools are done. But there is no one who will go in, especially the county person who is in charge of public works, and going towards schools and checking how these buildings are coming up. Is not doing due diligence.
Edward, you know this for a fact.
I know this for a fact because we've been trying to move around schools, and not just within the country, across the continent. Like remember, like in Nigeria, for example, there's a case whereby we had the Chibok girls, kidnapping issue, and we said in Nigeria, together with the National Emergency Management Agency, we looked at how do you protect schools? What are the compounds? What are the fences? What is the kind of boundaries you put in schools? Do you put soldiers in schools in high-risk areas or not? So these are data we have been collecting across the continent. Not
I
just
want to ask again,
Yes.
because what you're saying and what you're alleging here is actually a very serious issue.
Yes.
You're saying that the people who are charged with inspecting schools are not looking at safety. They are focusing on academic. They are saying, how many students do you have in this? Have they registered for KCP? Have they registered for KCSE? That's what they're focusing on. You're saying they're not looking at the quality of the buildings, the quality of the structures. They're not looking at the size of the kitchen, the people who are working in the kitchen, the health protocols, the safety protocols in that school. And you're saying you know this for a fact.
Yes, I know this for a fact because what you have curriculum support officers. Curriculum support officers are the ones who are put in. And then you have now the teacher development officers who now look at the teaching aspects. And TSC will send out these people, and sometimes the unions would go in and look at the context of the teachers. No one is actually going and checking on these safety aspects and even looking at the hiring, for example, of workers within schools. Now, another case which will scare you is the fact that we don't have rep offender registers.
Sorry?
Rep offender registers that actually can, a head teacher can check and say, I want to check against your name before I employ you as a teacher.
And where would this register be nestled?
It will be it's actually with the judiciary. But the headmaster will not have that, and also will not know if a worker, for example, has committed that crime and, run back to the The only thing we have right now is fingerprints.
Certificate of good conduct.
Yes,
from
certificate
police.
of good conduct. So we cannot check some of these even disciplinary issues or issues of crime, or for example,
Until after
someone
the
has to be.
fact.
Yeah, we don't check. Schools will not check that, and I know that for a matter of fact. The private schools might insist on it because at least they have an understanding, to know whether this person they been ever convicted of rape or defilement or drug abuse. That background check is not being done with many schools. Even, for example, for school drivers, to run for them breathalyzer tests before they take the students out, or to go and take the students. So we don't, there's a laissez-faire attitude, and this is something which, if you look at a lot of the spaces, for a fact I can confirm, there is no due diligence.
Why
Let's
do
take a
you
break.
think?
Let's take a break, City.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
The conversation continues with Edward Wanyonyi. He is the chairperson of the Disaster Risk Reduction Network for African Journalists. City.
I forgot what I wanted to ask. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you was this. The picture you paint is a daunting one. Are we saying that the people who are charged with these duties of reducing what you're calling risk don't understand their functions, or is it that they are ill-prepared, they are ill-resourced to actually do what they're supposed to do?
I think the focus has been on this campaign of education for all, which just looks at access. How many children are we bringing on board? 100% transition. No one has looked at quality. A bit of time, around 2010, we actually started talking about learner outcomes. So whether there's literacy, numeracy, everything, that was the concern, not the quality, which also includes the space. And so even in the quality assurance department in the Ministry of Education, you'll have very few safety experts. It's a by the way. By the way, where do you guys fetch your water? Oh, we have a borehole. So when was the borehole tested? What are the test results? Who comes to check? Nothing that goes beyond the ordinary. It's thrown in as by the way. I went to my former high school some time back, and we're trying to see this quite a number of buildings coming up, and we're like, where are the fire exits? How many? This is almost a 3-story building. How do you help a person who has a disability? And they're like, okay, fine, we'll now think about accommodating them at the ground floor. We will work out, how many they come, we will work out that. And so we're like, they're quite a challenge in terms of that building process inspection. And we're asking, does the county engineer come to check? They're like, yeah, they do pass by, they check, and we will make by, because the allocation we're getting every year, we're getting 900 students. We are now doing 12 streams. At times we're having 4 streams. Now they're doing 12 streams. So where are these other students? They're sleeping on the corridors. They're sleeping on the dining, on the floor. And it's just a challenge. It's like common for children to struggle and have a hard time in high school.
They've normalized these low standards, okay?
Yes.
Now, there's a mindset that brings this about.
Yes.
This is really what I'm getting at. How then do you cure? Because, as we like saying, it's systemic. It seems to be in the system.
Yes.
The education system that's supposed to oversee this doesn't. Departments that's supposed to deal with these things within government are ill-resourced. They are nestled in ministries where they're suddenly just lost. And they only seem to function when there's a disaster. And even then, they function by name. But in averting disaster and ensuring it doesn't happen, now, let's leave the education ministry aside. Let's look at the parents whose children go there and who would bear the brunt if something did occur. As in the cases you mentioned, parents bear the brunt, students bear the brunt. How do you explain parents whose children go to these schools not pitching a fit about this and saying,
Standards.
why is it that this is so? And yet they have parents associations, they're represented at the board of management. Why? Are we saying that we have a society that is quite content to pretend that there is no disaster that's going to happen, or we are such a faith-based society that we believe that when we've covered this whole issue with prayer, yes, that no disaster will befall us? I mean, What are we talking about here?
There's a level of detachment among parents, and not just parents, even we are now talking about the role of school alumni associations in part of the advocacy to demand for a level of accountability. Now also we are saying that board of management needs to be independent and not get caught up in the procurement wars and get, in bed and co-opted with the school administration, because that's a challenge. Some of these spaces, you find the boards of management are the suppliers of one or two services within the school, so they can't raise a voice against the head teacher and say this is wrong. So we need to find a way in which we can be able to raise accountability, and also parents to be able to look at, it's not just about students going in and getting an A, because that's an excitement that many parents have, the score that my child will have. And also one death should be a scare for all parents, because that could be you who is losing a child and you're burying a child. There was a case in a school in Western also where, a child was left without early treatment and died of pneumonia. And this was a case whereby the child kept on complaining, I cannot wake up in the morning, it's very cold, it's chilly, I have this condition. But they were like, no, you're just pretending, And so we have a lot of these cases, and we're talking about the student welfare aspects, and they should be better managed besides just being placed at guiding and counseling. That's where the location of the safety champions in schools, a safety, advisor, a safety team that is formed both of students and the school should be part and parcel of this, so that this can be a level of a protocol. Even when you're talking about right now school games that are happening, is there an ambulance there? What happens in terms of students who go there? What if there's a case of a student who is convulsing, and maybe that is a school captain? What happens? So there are dynamics to do with how we actually operationalize this, but it starts first of all by sensitization of the school management. TSC needs to take a firm stance against school teachers, head teachers especially, who are negligent. Two, parents associations need to come up more. School alumni associations need to come up more and demand for something.
Edward, do you realize that we're discussing this and assuming that these people actually understand what they're supposed to do, what they really are supposed to do?
Do they see it as an issue?
Yes.
It's a challenge in terms of where we make it seem to be laissez-faire because you're obsessed with grades.
No, it isn't. The obsession with grades we get.
Yeah.
But this apathy that you're describing,
Yes.
it presupposes that they actually know what they ought to do and they're not doing it. And I'm saying they don't. I'm actually saying even the people in the ministry, they don't. Specialists like you do, okay?
Yeah.
But everybody else in this supposed space doesn't, in all honesty, they don't. If they know how it is they can steal from the school, they know because they know how to steal, isn't it? They have knowledge.
Yes.
If the board of management are part and parcel of procurement processes, it's because they know there's knowledge and it is demonstrated by the action. But this laissez-faire attitude that you're saying, it's like they may see it, but they don't really know what to do. They may understand, but they don't know what to do. There is something that happened in Germany, something that was later referred to as the Holocaust. It spread even to Poland and some of the countries that Germany decided to colonize. Now, the successive government within the Republic of Germany sought to ensure that this thing never happens again. You know what they did?
Yeah.
They made sure that the Holocaust is in the curriculum from kindergarten. It's not, you're not escaping this thing. It's a mandatory subject. You are taught, and as you get to the high school, you are taught history. You go to museums, meaning this thing is in your system. You cannot pretend. Now, when you have a child, talking about from 1946, 47 up to now, by the time this person grows up and becomes an adult, if they then behave in a manner that is contrary to this, they know. They cannot say, how do I know 1 + 1? Because I was taught. Do we teach this 1 + 1 about this very important subject? Do people even know? Because if parents can't challenge, if students were taught, don't you think they would be able to challenge their teachers?
Yeah, Kenya Red Cross Society has been pushing for, a better enhanced kind of curriculum around first aid issues within the schools.
Why are the Red Cross pushing the agenda? Why the Red Cross? I'm not saying they shouldn't.
Because they are the experts.
They may be the experts, but then are they the only experts?
Ideally, it should be, fronted. That's why we're saying if you lack a national disaster management authority that can actually be able to put in place a stronger framework, then what happens is that it's left hanging. No one is going to talk about it. So there is no one who is doing. Even there's a time we're pushing Ministry of Education to say, can we have a national safety week? Like just 1 week in a school calendar where just the Monday to Friday schools are just doing safety issues, awareness and everything. But then they say that is being done by guiding and counseling. They think
That is not true.
Of course.
You'll find the whole school has one teacher, one who's responsible for guidance and counseling
And
in
it's
the
not the
entire
only
school.
thing that they're doing. They're also a subject teacher for something
Yes.
else. So,
And most of the time, that guiding and counseling teacher will be the patron of the Christian Union or the
Yes.
the
Yes.
Catholic school. So,
Yes.
so the idea is to moralize these conversations. And even when fires break out in schools, when the students come back, besides just the parent being charged excessive amounts, the first thing they are always brought to is a prayer immersion to rebuke these things, that have caused this school. No one goes to look at the inner issues and the fact that we could have actually saved more lives, we could have saved more students, we would have saved more dormitories, because there was no critical
What can we do
protocol.
to improve
Yes.
and address the issues that led us where we are?
Yes.
So this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
What happened in that 2020 when the Ministry of Education embarked on a national inspection of schools?
The challenge is that it was hijacked by the CBC conversation to see how much classrooms we can get, we can expand. Then it became a procurement issue in terms of how many desks and so to accommodate. So both secondary schools were looking at getting expansions and, government capitation for that. So it became an issue to do with CBC. It did not become an issue to do with internal issues. After Garissa, the ministry response was, do we have to start putting metal scanners in university accessways? And it always, the safety conversation always switches towards either a moral
commercial.
or a commercial. It doesn't look at attitudinal, behavioral, and where we can hold accountable the school management in terms of, have you done X, Y, Z? And that's why the county education officers need to do more. They need to be accountable more.
We have a problem here.
Yes.
It's a really serious problem.
even as you talk about that, some of the, emerging conversations yesterday, I mean, even from Monday when we saw this case, the first case from school, and then now seeing Butere happening yesterday, the first conversation started already to be at the county level that somebody then must be held responsible. And we're talking about prosecutorial issues here.
Yes.
That if you see that as a result of your negligence, 1, 2, 3 has happened, the only
thing to do is to hold you
thereafter
accountable.
is to hold you accountable, because we're now on the verge of criminality.
And that's why Mutula Kilonzo, the late, you're saying, I will hold everyone in that chain process accountable. But then you see...
But it starts with then the CS himself.
Yes,
absolutely.
Because he has
Exactly.
not put in a policy on safety in schools.
Yes.
Because, I mean, if you go to the local school principal and say, we are holding you accountable, headmistress of Mukumu girls, because of what has happened. Okay, so what was I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Show me what I was supposed to do that I did not do.
But here you are. Do you remember? I remember. I mean, at that time I took issue with the late CS Magoha, when he spoke to a gentleman on a council in a certain manner, when it was over an issue that was supposed to have been done, and it was still okay. We're schmoozing about, we're planning, and he said, "No, don't be an idiot. This thing is actually supposed to be done. I don't want to hear how you're planning to do, because it's a matter really of life and death.
Should be done.
It should be done."
Yes.
And should be sure that because you say it has been done, we should all then believe that it has been done, and we will not have a situation whereby 244 children are in hospital and 3 of them are dead. It should not be. So is this the same kind of attitude that we are seeing? And then is it not a blatant, open, clear-cut case for prosecution?
Yes, it should be clear-cut so that there's a level of deterrence. And not only just deterrence, now we are saying parents should take the stance. And when you're going for your annual general meeting in the schools, raise these issues. school alumni associations should raise these issues so that there is heat from all sides. Otherwise, what will happen? We will get another death, and then we will just let it slide, and then many will increase. So the challenge is that we are saying that the issue comes up, but then no one picks it up. We don't have a champion of safety in the Ministry of Education.
No one runs with it.
Yeah.
You know, Edward, there's somebody with a syringe here and they want to inject you with a dose of reality. Onyango Odayo says, good morning. It's very interesting to listen to people who live in utopia and attempt to bring utopic supposition into a public high school space. Please, when you're done, cost the suggestions and weigh them against the source of high school funds. Okay? We are all struggling, even schools.
I think for me, the question of saying that capitation, is less. Yes, I accept it, but I think there are issues to do with attitude, not just costing. Then the issues to do with attitude, not costing per se, and in acting right at home. Even I would just challenge Onyango to say at home, at his home, if there is a risk. If he has built, for example, a latrine that is supposed to sink, he will find ways to actually deal with it and move out or do something. So there is attitude issues first before we come to the resourcing. We are not saying that now we are going to put a mandatory and say now you have to have X number of fire alarms and engines per school and ambulances. No. We're just saying that there are basic issues, like before a school opens, is there a checklist that they have to go through for purposes of just confirming that this is there? Is there a designated safety champion in the school?
Let me ask the question. Some of the old national schools which have a really strong alumni, do you ever hear of these schools having these problems? Ever?
Some of the big national schools?
Yes.
Well...
No, you do not.
You do not.
Well, some of the big schools, one big school in Nairobi had a fire incident a couple of years ago.
Air fire.
Students died.
Yes, they did.
Okay?
Yes.
And it was all because of the lack of proper safety measures.
Yes, and 1 or 2 or 3 students were charged.
Yes.
There's a young lady who was charged when she was a minor, and the issue went up until she was an adult. Now she was in court being charged as an adult.
Yeah.
Now, what does it point to? What ought to have been done? This punitive way, yes, I'm not saying one shouldn't go through the court system, but it's not the only way to deal with these things. It can't be that every time there is a disaster, yes, there's a legal process that must be followed, but all you think is once things have gone to court, you've resolved the matter. You haven't. You haven't. And how long did it stay in the news? Well, there were parents whose station in life in this country was fairly illuminated. So this story stayed on for some time. But it's not less of a disaster than in some of the schools where it happens more often.
Yep.
Okay? It's like the issue of cancer was highlighted in this country when we had prominent individuals within our society who are diagnosed with it and some passed away because of cancer. Then cancer became an issue and was discussed and then it died again. It is this mindset that I am concerned about when I say we have a problem. Because some of these things are not really expensive. And you're right. It's a question of the attitude and the mind.
Yes.
You see it in the roads that we build. A road is built, it's not maintained. So a small little patch, you give it time, it rains, that thing becomes a crater in the middle of the road. And you can see it becoming. It's the same attitude. And yet there are people who are paid a salary to ensure that that doesn't happen. And they have the means to. Now, with regards to school and our students, why I'm saying we have a danger is all these students, watch all these things and they learn. When these students become adults, what sort of adults do you think these students are going to be?
Yeah, they're going to perfect the same thing.
That is where my worry is from. Then we'll get into the Kenyan thing of looking for someone to blame and looking for where to push the blame. And yet, this is something we could have averted.
Yeah, because look, last year when using Mukumu girls as an example, last year when this thing happened, the same thing, mind you, fortunately, nobody died. This year, unfortunately, 3 people died. If it's a pattern that we are following, 2024, if something else happens without this being checked, how many more will die? And here we are talking about it being utopia. It's not. It's a very simple thing here of actually doing what you have to do. And you don't need, I'm sorry, but in some cases, to check your safety, to make sure the next person is doing their job, doesn't require a cent. It doesn't. It doesn't require a cent. To check your stores, to make sure that the aflatoxin has not seeped into the maize that you're storing or the beans that you're storing. No. For somebody to do their job and check that a latrine has not sunk, doesn't cost a shilling.
It may cost a cent in terms of the remedial measures. So, for example,
Sure, but for somebody to go and
if
check and
this
say,
studio
Oga
becomes-
Eric, this
if-
thing is not working.
if this studio becomes the storage for 2,000 students, maize for 2,000 students,
there's going to be
it's going to have a problem. Now, you have checked and you have said, we need a bigger store.
But now,
Okay.
in this case, the problem is there is nobody going to check and say, we need a bigger store.
But you don't know
Do
that.
you get?
There's somebody going to check, but this isn't their priority.
Yes.
They actually pay to do to check, but they are the ones who know what they
Okay,
go
so
and
now,
check.
do you pay for it to be a priority? Do you have to spend for it to be a priority in somebody's mind? You don't. You don't.
Like you said, Edward, the issue of the National Disaster Management Authority. There was a bill, it died somewhere.
Yeah, it's gotten stuck in Parliament for almost over 14 years.
A bill on the National Disaster Management Authority. Everybody plus their grandmother's cat that has gone to the monastery knows that we need this. But somewhere it never moves. So unless we have such a body that then comes up with, looks at policy issues, looks at advisory to all government agencies, at all public institutions on disaster preparedness, disaster response, then we are still getting stuck somewhere. But we thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's an interesting conversation and we have to keep having it. More comments coming in on social media. It's essential for the CEC for Health to review their current programs and strategies to identify any gaps and make the necessary improvements. It's crucial to ensure the public health officials are well equipped. That's the Kakamega County CEC for Health to make sure that, everything is working in their jurisdiction. All right. Edward Wanyonyi is a chairperson of the Disaster Risk Reduction Network for African Journalists. He's been here. We've been talking about disaster preparedness, disaster response, and using these schools as an example. What's happening at Mukumu Girls and Butere Boys, where girls and boys have fallen ill, schools have been closed, some have died. It's a big issue.